The morning sun cast long shadows across Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood by her bedroom window, watching the world slowly wake up. The headlines from the previous evening still echoed in her mind, each word carrying the weight of a nation's collective sorrow. A devastating fire at a residential care facility in Manchester had claimed the lives of 17 elderly residents, leaving families shattered and communities reeling from the tragedy. William emerged from their private study, his phone still buzzing with messages from palace staff, government officials, and media representatives, all seeking guidance on the official royal response. The formal statements had already been issued, flowers would be sent, and charitable donations would be made through proper channels. Yet something felt incomplete about the traditional approach, something that didn't capture the raw emotion both William and Catherine were experiencing as parents, as human beings who understood loss in their own profound way. Catherine turned from the window, her expression thoughtful yet determined. She had spent much of the night thinking about the families affected by the tragedy, imagining the phone calls they had received, the rushed drives to the hospital, the unbearable waiting in sterile corridors only to receive news that would change their lives forever. The princess had always possessed an intuitive understanding of human suffering, perhaps sharpened by her own experiences with loss and the weight of public scrutiny that had shaped her adult life. The couple had breakfast with their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, in the warm familiarity of their private dining room. The younger children chattered about their upcoming school activities, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded hours away. George, however, with the perceptiveness that often surprised his parents, noticed the subdued mood of his mother and father. "Is everything all right, Mama?" he asked, his fork pausing midway to his mouth, laden with scrambled eggs. Catherine exchanged a glance with William before gently explaining that sometimes sad things happen to good people, and that their role as members of the royal family meant they tried to help and comfort others during difficult times. It was a conversation they had had variations of before, preparing their eldest for the realities of their unique position in society. But it never became easier to explain the complexities of duty, service, and human compassion to young minds. After the children had left for school with their protection officers and nannies, William and Catherine retreated to their private sitting room. The space reflected their personal taste rather than royal grandeur, with comfortable sofas, family photographs, and the gentle chaos that comes with 3 young children. It was here, in this intimate setting, that some of their most important decisions were made, away from the formality of official meetings and the weight of centuries of protocol. Catherine picked up her tablet and began reading the news coverage more thoroughly. The stories emerging from Manchester painted a picture of a tight-knit community devastated by an unthinkable loss. Families who had entrusted their most vulnerable members to the care facility were now grappling with grief, guilt, and a profound sense of helplessness. The victims ranged in age from 72 to 96, each with their own rich history, families who loved them, and stories that would now be told in past tense. Among the heart-wrenching accounts, one story particularly caught Catherine's attention. Margaret Thompson, an 84-year-old former teacher, had been one of the victims. Her granddaughter, Sarah, was quoted in several articles describing how her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 8 years old. Margaret had been more than a grandmother. She had been a mother, a best friend, and the cornerstone of Sarah's world. What struck Catherine most deeply was Sarah's description of her grandmother's unwavering optimism and her habit of sending handwritten notes to former students, many of whom were now adults with children of their own. Even in her 80s, Margaret had maintained correspondence with dozens of people whose lives she had touched during her 4 decades of teaching. The care facility had become her new classroom, where she organized reading circles and helped other residents write letters to their families. William, who had been reviewing briefing notes for his upcoming engagements, noticed his wife's emotional response to what she was reading. He moved to sit beside her on the sofa, reading over her shoulder as she scrolled through the tributes to Margaret and the other victims. The stories revealed not just lives lost, but entire networks of love and support that have been suddenly severed. "These aren't just statistics," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying a weight that William immediately recognized. It was the same tone she used when she spoke about the children in the hospital wards they visited, or the families struggling with mental health issues that her charitable work had brought to her attention. These are people who mattered enormously to others. People who had so much more to give. William nodded, understanding the direction of his wife's thoughts without needing explicit explanation. They had both grown up with the knowledge that their public positions came with privileges, but, more importantly, with responsibilities. The traditional royal response to tragedies was important and necessary, but sometimes the most meaningful gestures were the quietest ones, the actions taken without fanfare or media coverage. Catherine stood and walked to the window again, this time looking out at the gardens where their children often played. She thought about Margaret Thompson's granddaughter, Sarah, who was now facing a world without the woman who had shaped her entire life. She thought about the other families, each dealing with their own version of devastating loss, each needing something that formal condolences and official flowers couldn't provide. "I want to write to them," Catherine said, turning back to face her husband. "To the families." Not as the Princess of Wales making an official statement, but as someone who understands that words matter, that being seen and heard in grief can make a difference. William considered this carefully. Personal correspondence from members of the royal family was not unprecedented, but it was usually coordinated through private secretaries and followed established protocols. What Catherine was suggesting was something more intimate, more personal, and inherently more risky from a public relations perspective. If the gesture were to become public, it could be seen as either deeply compassionate or inappropriately personal, depending on how it was perceived and reported. "It would need to be completely private," William said thoughtfully. "No media involvement, no official announcements. Just human connection." Catherine nodded emphatically. This was exactly what she had envisioned. Not a photo opportunity or a publicity gesture, but a genuine attempt to reach out to people in their darkest moments and offer whatever small comfort her words might provide. They spent the next hour discussing the practicalities. How would they obtain the family's addresses without going through official channels that might compromise the privacy of the gesture? How could they ensure that the letters remained confidential, if that's what the family preferred? How would they craft messages that felt authentic and helpful rather than intrusive or patronizing? Catherine had always been a natural writer, someone who could express complex emotions with clarity and warmth. Her personal letters to friends and family were cherished by recipients for their thoughtfulness and genuine care. But writing to strangers in grief presented unique challenges. Each family situation was different. Each relationship with their lost loved one was unique, and each person's way of processing grief would require its own approach. William suggested they start with Margaret Thompson's family, partly because Catherine had been so moved by the stories about the former teacher, but also because the extensive media coverage had provided enough detail about Margaret's life and relationships to craft a meaningful, specific message rather than a generic condolence. Catherine retrieved her personal stationery from her desk, the simple cream-colored paper with her personal monogram that she used for private correspondence. She had learned early in her royal life that handwritten notes carried a weight and significance that typed letters could never match. In an age of digital communication, the physical act of putting pen to paper demonstrated a level of care and attention that recipients could literally hold in their hands. She began writing several draft versions of a letter to Sarah Thompson, Margaret's granddaughter. The first attempt felt too formal, too distant. The second was perhaps too personal, making assumptions about Sarah's feelings that might not be accurate. The third began to capture the tone she was seeking, respectful, genuine, and focused on celebrating Margaret's life rather than simply acknowledging the loss. Meanwhile, William had quietly contacted one of their most trusted staff members, someone who had been with them since their early married years and understood their commitment to privacy in personal matters. Without revealing the specific purpose, he asked for assistance in discreetly obtaining contact information for the families affected by the Manchester tragedy. The staff member, accustomed to unusual requests that required absolute discretion, agreed to help without asking unnecessary questions. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine continued refining her letter to Sarah Thompson. She wrote about how Margaret's story had touched her deeply, how the descriptions of a woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing and teaching others had reminded her of the teachers who had shaped her own education. She shared how, as a mother, she could only imagine the profound impact of losing someone who had been both grandmother and parent, someone whose love had been the foundation of an entire life. The letter was carefully crafted to avoid any mention of her royal status or official position. Instead, Catherine wrote as one woman to another, one person who had experienced loss to someone currently drowning in grief. She mentioned her own children, not as potential heirs to the throne, but as young people who were learning about empathy and service through their parents' example. William read the final draft and was struck by its authenticity. Catherine had managed to convey genuine sympathy without being intrusive, to acknowledge the magnitude of Sarah's loss without presuming to understand it completely, and to offer comfort without making promises she couldn't keep. Most importantly, the letter celebrated Margaret Thompson's life and legacy in specific, meaningful ways that demonstrated Catherine had truly listened to the stories being shared about the remarkable woman. As evening approached, they made the decision to move forward with their quiet mission. They would write to as many families as they could reach, offering not the formal condolences of the Prince and Princess of Wales, but the heartfelt sympathy of two parents who believed in the power of human connection during life's darkest moments. The first letter was sealed and prepared for delivery, beginning what would become one of the most meaningful and private acts of compassion in their public service careers. Neither William nor Catherine could have anticipated how this simple gesture would ripple outward, touching not just the immediate recipients, but eventually inspiring a movement of kindness that would reach far beyond the borders of Manchester or even the United Kingdom. As they tucked their own children into bed that night, both parents reflected on the fragility of life and the importance of making every moment count. The tragedy in Manchester had reminded them that behind every headline were real people with real stories, and sometimes the most powerful response to overwhelming grief was simply to witness it, acknowledge it, and offer whatever small comfort was within their power to give. The letters they would write over the following days would remain private for months, known only to the families who received them and treasured as unexpected lights in their darkest hours. But the impact of this quiet act of compassion would eventually become a story that touched millions, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound gestures of leadership happen not on public stages, but in the sacred space between one human heart and another. The morning after Catherine had written her first letter brought a gentle spring rain to London, the kind that seemed to wash the city clean and leave everything looking fresh and renewed. Inside Kensington Palace, however, the atmosphere was one of quiet determination as Catherine and William prepared to expand their private mission of comfort to the other families affected by the Manchester tragedy. Catherine had woken early, her mind already focused on the task ahead. The previous evening's letter to Sarah Thompson had been carefully hand-delivered by one of their most trusted staff members, with strict instructions that it was to remain completely confidential unless the recipient chose otherwise. Now, as she sat at her writing desk with the morning light streaming through the tall windows, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with reaching out to people in their most vulnerable moments. William entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea and a folder containing the information their staff member had discreetly gathered about the other families. Each page contained basic details about the victims and their surviving relatives, carefully compiled from public obituaries, news reports, and social media tributes. The information was limited, but it provided enough detail for Catherine to craft personal, meaningful letters rather than generic condolences. The second letter she chose to write was to the family of Robert Shun, a 78-year-old former engineer who had immigrated to Manchester from Hong Kong in the 1960s. Robert had built a successful consulting business and raised 4 children who had all become successful professionals. His daughter, Linda, had been quoted in the local newspaper describing how her father had continued solving complex engineering problems even in his final years at the care facility, helping other residents fix broken radios and teaching the staff more efficient ways to organize the daily activities. Catherine found herself deeply moved by the story of a man who had traveled thousands of miles to build a new life in a foreign country, who had contributed his skills and knowledge to his adopted community for over 5 decades, and who had continued to serve others even in his final chapter. She thought about the courage it must have taken for Robert to leave everything familiar behind, to start over in a place where the language, culture, and customs were completely different from everything he had known. As she began writing to Linda Chun, Catherine reflected on her own experiences of adaptation and change. While her circumstances were vastly different from Robert's, she understood something about the challenge of entering a new world with different expectations, different rules, and different ways of being. Her transition from private citizen to royal family member had required its own form of courage and resilience. The letter to Linda Chun took a different approach from the one she had written to Sarah Thompson. While both were deeply personal, this message focused on celebrating Robert's legacy of service and innovation, his role as a bridge between cultures, and his dedication to continuing to contribute even in his later years. Catherine wrote about the importance of immigrants in British society, about the courage required to build new lives in foreign places, and about the ripple effects of one person's commitment to helping others. William, meanwhile, was working on his own letter to the family of James Mitchell, an 82-year-old former postal worker who had been described by his son as the most reliable person anyone could imagine. James had worked the same postal route for 37 years, becoming a beloved figure in his neighborhood who knew every resident by name and often served as an unofficial counselor and friend to people going through difficult times. The story that had particularly struck William was about how James had continued his tradition of service even after retirement and his eventual move to the care facility. He had organized a letter-writing program for residents who had difficulty maintaining correspondence with family and friends, personally ensuring that every birthday card was sent on time and every important family update was shared. In many ways, James had turned the care facility into an extension of the postal route he had served so faithfully for decades. Writing this letter challenged William to think about service in a different way. His own service to the country was defined by constitutional duty, inherited responsibility, and public obligation. James Mitchell's service had been chosen daily, demonstrated through small acts of reliability and kindness that had accumulated over decades into a profound impact on his community. There was something both humbling and inspiring about the comparison. As the morning progressed, both William and Catherine found themselves completely absorbed in the stories of the people they were writing about. Each letter required careful research, thoughtful consideration of the recipient's likely emotional state, and the delicate balance of offering comfort without intruding on private grief. The process was emotionally demanding, but also deeply meaningful, connecting them to the human stories behind the tragic headlines in a way that traditional royal responses could never achieve. Catherine's third letter was to the wife of Arthur Davidson, an 89-year-old former librarian who had been married to his wife Elizabeth for 63 years. The newspaper article about Arthur had included a photograph of the elderly couple holding hands during one of Elizabeth's daily visits to the care facility. Arthur had suffered from dementia in his final years, but Elizabeth had visited him every single day, reading him the same favorite books over and over, maintaining a connection that transcended the disease's cruel effects on memory and recognition. Writing to Elizabeth Davidson required Catherine to confront one of her deepest fears as a wife and mother. The idea of losing William or of watching him fade away while being powerless to help was almost too painful to contemplate. Yet that was exactly what Elizabeth had lived through, maintaining love and devotion even when the person she loved could no longer fully return or even recognize those feelings. Catherine's letter to Elizabeth was perhaps the most emotionally challenging of the three she had written that morning. She found herself writing about the mystery of love that persists beyond memory, about the courage required to show up every day even when the person you're visiting can no longer remember your name, and about the profound impact that such faithfulness has on everyone who witnesses it. She wrote about how Arthur's story had reminded her that love is not just a feeling, but a choice made daily, sometimes hourly, to continue caring even when it's difficult. The letter also touched on the unique grief that comes with losing someone to dementia, how the loss happens gradually over many years, and how the final goodbye can be both devastating and, in some ways, a relief from the long struggle of watching a loved one disappear piece by piece. Catherine was careful not to presume to understand Elizabeth's specific experience, but she acknowledged the particular complexity of this type of grief. William's second letter was to the children of Mary O'Sullivan, a 91-year-old former nurse who had worked in the same Manchester hospital for 45 years before retiring. Mary's daughter had described how her mother had continued to exhibit her nursing instincts even in the care facility, comforting other residents during difficult moments and somehow knowing exactly what to say to family members who were struggling with their own loved one's decline. The story of Mary O'Sullivan resonated with William because of his own deep respect for healthcare professionals and his understanding of service that extended beyond official duty. Through his work with various charities and his military service, he had witnessed the dedication of people who chose careers focused on caring for others, often at personal cost in terms of emotional energy and physical demands. His letter to Mary's children focused on the concept of a calling that extends beyond formal employment, about how some people carry their commitment to service throughout their entire lives, and about the immeasurable impact that such dedication has on countless individuals over the course of a career. He wrote about how Mary's instinct to comfort and care had clearly been not just a professional skill, but a fundamental part of who she was as a person. As the afternoon approached, both William and Catherine had written multiple letters, each one requiring significant emotional investment and careful attention to detail. The process was exhausting in a way that their usual royal duties rarely were. Official engagements, while often meaningful, followed established patterns and protocols. This private correspondence required them to be completely present with each story, to truly listen to the details of lives they had never encountered, and to find authentic ways to honor those lives through words. Their staff member returned with additional information about other families, bringing the total number of potential letters to 17, one for each person who had died in the tragedy. Some families would be more difficult to reach than others, and some might not welcome contact from strangers, even well-meaning ones. William and Catherine understood that they needed to be prepared for the possibility that some families might find their gesture intrusive rather than comforting. They decided to take a break from writing and spend some time with their own children who had returned from school full of stories about their day. George had a project about community helpers that required him to interview someone who served others, and he immediately thought of asking his parents about their work. Charlotte had learned a new song in music class and insisted on performing it for the entire family. Louis had made a drawing of the family dog and wanted it displayed prominently on the refrigerator. These normal family moments provided a necessary emotional reset for William and Catherine. The weight of engaging so deeply with stories of loss and grief required balance, and their children's natural joy and enthusiasm reminded them of the continuity of life, the importance of hope, and the responsibility they had to model resilience and compassion. During dinner, George asked his parents about the project on community helpers, wondering if he could interview them about their royal duties. Catherine found herself thinking about all the ways people serve their communities, from the grand public gestures that make headlines to the quiet daily acts of kindness that never receive recognition. She told George about postal workers like James Mitchell, teachers like Margaret Thompson, nurses like Mary O'Sullivan, and engineers like Robert Shun, emphasizing that every person who chose to help others was making their community stronger. William added that sometimes the most important help happens when no one is watching, when people choose to be kind simply because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect recognition or reward. He talked about how the letters they were writing were a small example of this kind of service, done not for public acknowledgement, but because they believed words of comfort could make a difference in someone's darkest moment. After the children were in bed, William and Catherine returned to their letters. They had several more to write, and each one required the same careful attention and emotional investment as the ones they had completed earlier. The challenge was maintaining the authenticity and personal connection while managing their own emotional responses to the accumulating stories of loss. Catherine's fourth letter was to the family of Dorothy Williams, a 76-year-old former seamstress who had made wedding dresses for 3 generations of Manchester brides. Dorothy's granddaughter had shared how her grandmother had taught her to sew, passing down not just technical skills, but an appreciation for craftsmanship, patience, and the importance of creating beautiful things that would become part of people's most treasured memories. This letter allowed Catherine to connect through her own interest in fashion and design, but more importantly, through her understanding of how skills and wisdom are passed down through generations. She wrote about the irreplaceable value of grandmothers who serve as bridges between past and future, who carry family traditions and ensure they survive into new generations. She reflected on how Dorothy's legacy would live on not just in the dresses she had created, but in the skills and values she had passed down to her granddaughter. As the evening progressed and the pile of completed letters grew, both William and Catherine felt a deep sense of purpose and connection. What had begun as a response to a tragic news story had evolved into something much more meaningful, a reminder of the profound impact that individual lives have on their communities and the importance of recognizing and honoring those contributions even in death. The quiet act of writing these letters was teaching them as much as it was hopefully comforting the recipients. Each story revealed different ways of living a meaningful life, different approaches to service and love, and different examples of how ordinary people could have extraordinary impacts through their daily choices and actions. Neither of them could have predicted that their private gesture of compassion would eventually become a story that inspired millions of people around the world to reconsider their own capacity for quiet acts of kindness. 3 weeks after the first letter had been quietly delivered to Sarah Thompson, an unexpected phone call reached the private secretary's office at Kensington Palace. The caller was Sarah herself, her voice filled with emotion as she asked if there was any way she could personally thank the Princess of Wales for the beautiful letter she had received about her grandmother Margaret. The private secretary, bound by the strict confidentiality that William and Catherine had requested around their letter-writing mission, could only acknowledge that they had received the call and would pass along Sarah's gratitude. However, Sarah's response had been so deeply moved and grateful that the secretary felt compelled to share the details with the royal couple. Catherine was in the middle of reviewing her weekly schedule when the secretary briefed her about Sarah's call. The young woman had apparently called the palace's main number and been transferred several times before reaching someone who could help her. She had explained that she had been hesitant to call at all, unsure if it was appropriate, but the letter had meant so much to her that she felt she had to try to express her gratitude somehow. According to the secretary, Sarah had said that the letter had arrived on what had been one of her darkest days, when the reality of her grandmother's death was just beginning to sink in and she was struggling with the overwhelming task of sorting through Margaret's belongings. The personal nature of the letter, the specific details about her grandmother's life as a teacher, and the genuine warmth of the words had provided comfort at exactly the moment when she needed it most. More significantly, Sarah had mentioned that she had shared the letter with other family members, and that it had helped them all process their grief in a healthier way. The letter had reminded them to focus on celebrating Margaret's incredible life, rather than only mourning her death. It had prompted them to share stories and memories they might not have otherwise discussed, creating a healing ritual around remembering the woman who had meant so much to them all. Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her letter had achieved exactly what she had hoped it would. The goal had never been to eliminate grief or provide false comfort, but rather to acknowledge the significance of a life well lived and to offer the kind of recognition that Margaret Thompson deserved. Hearing that the letter had helped an entire family process their loss more positively confirmed that the effort had been worthwhile. William, who was reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming environmental summit, looked up when Catherine shared Sarah's response with him. They had both wondered whether their letters would be welcomed or if families might find them intrusive during such a difficult time. Sarah's call provided the first concrete evidence that their quiet mission was having the intended effect. Over the following days, more responses began to arrive through various channels. Linda Chun had written a formal letter to the palace, expressing her family's gratitude for the thoughtful words about her father Robert's legacy as an engineer and immigrant success story. She mentioned that the letter had inspired the family to establish a small scholarship fund for immigrant students studying engineering, as a way of continuing her father's commitment to helping others achieve their dreams through education and hard work. Elizabeth Davidson, the widow who had visited her dementia-afflicted husband Arthur every day for years, had sent a handwritten note that was perhaps even more moving than the letter Catherine had written to her. Elizabeth shared that Catherine's words about love being a daily choice had helped her realize that her years of faithful visits had been more valuable than she had understood. She had sometimes felt guilty for feeling relieved when Arthur finally passed away, but Catherine's letter had helped her understand that such feelings were normal and didn't diminish the love she had shown throughout his illness. Most surprisingly, Elizabeth had mentioned that she was now volunteering to support other families dealing with dementia, using her experience to help guide others through the difficult journey she had navigated for so many years. Catherine's letter had apparently helped Elizabeth see that her experience, as painful as it had been, had given her unique insights that could benefit others facing similar challenges. James Mitchell's son had responded through the palace's online contact system, sharing that his father's tradition of letter writing had inspired the family to start a community correspondence program at the local library. The program would help elderly residents maintain connections with family and friends, exactly as James had done informally for decades. The royal letter acknowledging James's service had motivated the family to formalize and expand the kind of work that had given their father so much purpose. Each response reinforced Catherine and William's belief that their decision to write personal letters had been the right one. More than that, the responses were revealing something unexpected and beautiful. Their gesture of recognition was inspiring the recipients to find new ways to honor their loved ones' legacies through continued service to others. This development prompted Catherine to think more deeply about the nature of meaningful condolences. Traditional expressions of sympathy, while important, often focused on acknowledging loss and offering comfort. What seemed to be happening with their letters was something different. They were helping people transform grief into positive action, channeling the pain of loss into efforts to continue the work and values that their loved ones had embodied. William began to see parallels between this private letter-writing mission and their larger roles as public servants. The most effective royal engagements were often those that didn't just acknowledge problems or celebrate achievements, but that inspired people to take action themselves. Their letters were working on a similar principle, but at a much more intimate and personal level. As were the various family responses filtered back to them, Catherine and William realized they had inadvertently created a small movement of inspired action. The scholarship fund, the volunteer dementia support, the community correspondence program, and other initiatives that were emerging from their letters were having ripple effects that extended far beyond the original recipients. This unexpected development made them reconsider the potential impact of personal, private gestures of recognition and support. While their public roles involved substantial influence and platform, There was something uniquely powerful about the direct human connection that their letters had created. The intimacy and authenticity of the personal correspondence had touched recipients in a way that public statements or official visits might not have achieved. Catherine decided to write additional letters to families she hadn't yet contacted, but with a slightly different approach. Building on what she had learned from the responses, she began to include gentle suggestions about ways the recipients might consider honoring their loved ones' legacies through continued service or community involvement. These weren't prescriptive recommendations, but rather thoughtful observations about how the values and work of the deceased might continue to benefit others. Her letter to the family of Dorothy Williams, the seamstress who had made wedding dresses for 3 generations, mentioned how wonderful it would be if Dorothy's skills and dedication to craftsmanship could somehow continue to touch future brides. Catherine was careful not to suggest specific actions, but rather to plant seeds of possibility that the family might choose to pursue if they felt called to do so. Similarly, Williams' letter to the family of Mary O'Sullivan, the nurse who had comforted others throughout her career and even during her time at the care facility, reflected on how Mary's instinct for providing comfort during difficult moments was a gift that could continue to benefit people even after her death. Again, he avoided specific suggestions, but his words created space for the family to consider how they might honor their mother's legacy of care and service. The approach required delicate balance. The primary purpose of the letters remained offering comfort and recognition to grieving families. Any suggestions about continuing legacies had to be presented as possibilities rather than expectations, opportunities rather than obligations. The families were dealing with profound loss and needed space to process their grief without feeling pressured to take action. As spring progressed into early summer, the responses to their letters continued to arrive sporadically. Not every family responded, and Catherine and William respected that silence might indicate either privacy preferences or different ways of processing grief. The families who did respond, however, continued to demonstrate the transformative power of feeling truly seen and valued during their darkest moments. One particularly moving response came from the adult children of Frank Rodriguez, an 85-year-old former custodian who had worked at the same elementary school for 38 years. Frank's children shared that their father had never seen his work as particularly important or noteworthy, despite the fact that generations of children had loved and respected him. Catherine's letter, which celebrated Frank's role in creating safe, welcoming spaces for learning and his relationships with countless students over the decades, had helped his children understand the true significance of their father's contributions. Inspired by the recognition in Catherine's letter, Frank's children had reached out to the elementary school where he had worked. They were amazed to discover that the school had been planning to dedicate their new playground equipment to Frank's memory, having received dozens of messages from former students and their parents who wanted to honor the custodian who had been such a positive presence in their children's lives. The dedication ceremony, which Frank's family attended with deep pride, became a celebration not just of one man's service, but of all the often unrecognized workers who contribute to children's education and well-being. Local media covered the event, and the story spread to other communities, inspiring similar recognition for school support staff who rarely receive public acknowledgement for their important work. This chain of events demonstrated something that Catherine and William had not anticipated when they began their quiet letter-writing mission. Their private gestures of recognition were not only comforting grieving families, but were also contributing to a broader cultural conversation about whose work deserves recognition and how communities might better honor the contributions of all their members. The ripple effects continued to expand in ways that surprised and moved them both. A local newspaper in Manchester, somehow learning about several of the positive initiatives that had emerged from grieving families, wrote a feature story about how the tragedy had inspired an unexpected wave of community service and charitable activity. The article didn't mention the royal letters specifically, but it captured the spirit of transformation that Catherine and William had witnessed firsthand. Reading that article, Catherine realized that their quiet act had contributed to something larger than they had imagined. The family's grief had been transformed into purposeful action. Their loved ones' legacies were being continued and expanded, and entire communities were being inspired to recognize and value the contributions of ordinary people who had devoted their lives to serving others. The success of their letter-writing mission was measured not in public recognition or media coverage, but in the positive changes it had sparked in the lives of grieving families and the communities they served. It was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful leadership happens in private moments of connection, when powerful people use their influence not for personal gain or public acclaim, but to lift up others who are struggling and to honor lives that might otherwise be forgotten. As summer approached and the immediate crisis of the Manchester tragedy began to fade from daily headlines, the quiet work of healing and transformation that had been inspired by 17 personal letters continued to grow and spread, touching lives in ways that William and Catherine were only beginning to understand 6 months after the Manchester tragedy. Catherine was reviewing her correspondence when she received an unexpected package that would change everything. The return address showed it was from Sarah Thompson, Margaret's granddaughter, who had been the first person to respond to their private letter-writing mission. Inside the carefully wrapped package was a leather-bound scrapbook titled Letters That Changed Everything. As Catherine opened it, she discovered that Sarah had compiled stories, photographs, and updates from all 17 families who had received letters from William and Catherine following the care facility fire. Somehow, the families had found each other and had been sharing their experiences and the positive initiatives that had emerged from their grief. The scrapbook was extraordinary. Each family had contributed a section detailing not just their loved one's story, but also describing the impact that the royal letters had made on their healing process and the community project that had grown from their desire to honor their family members' legacies. Linda Chin's family had established the Robert Chun Engineering Scholarship, which had already awarded its first grants to 3 immigrant students pursuing engineering degrees. The scholarship recipients were required to participate in community service projects, extending Robert's tradition of using his skills to help others. The program had attracted attention from local engineering firms, who were now contributing additional funding and offering internships to scholarship recipients. Elizabeth Davidson had not only become a volunteer counselor for families dealing with dementia, but had written a guidebook for caregivers based on her years of experience visiting Arthur. The guidebook was being distributed through hospitals and care facilities throughout Manchester, providing practical advice and emotional support for families facing similar journeys. Elizabeth had included a photo of herself holding Catherine's letter, crediting it with helping her realize that her painful experience could become a source of healing for others. James Mitchell's family had expanded their community correspondence program into a nationwide initiative called Letters of Love, which now operated in over 50 libraries across the United Kingdom. The program helped elderly residents, people with disabilities, and others who had difficulty maintaining written connections with family and friends. Volunteers were trained to assist with letter writing, and the program had facilitated thousands of meaningful connections between people who might otherwise have lost touch. Frank Rodriguez's story had perhaps had the most unexpected impact. The playground dedication in his honor had inspired a national movement to recognize and appreciate school support staff. A Heroes in Our Schools campaign was now active in hundreds of schools, celebrating the contributions of custodians, cafeteria workers, crossing guards, and other staff members who supported children's education in essential but often overlooked ways. Dorothy Williams's granddaughter had started a nonprofit organization that provided free wedding dress alterations for brides facing financial hardships. The Dorothy's Dreams program had served over 200 brides, with volunteer seamstresses donating their time and skills to ensure that every woman could have a beautiful dress for her special day, regardless of her financial circumstances. The program had expanded to include dress donations and had inspired similar initiatives in other cities. Mary O'Sullivan's children had established a comfort care training program for medical facilities, teaching healthcare workers how to provide emotional and spiritual support to patients and families during difficult times. The program emphasized the holistic approach to care that Mary had embodied throughout her nursing career, focusing not just on medical treatment, but on the human connections that could make healing more possible. Page after page of the scrapbook revealed similar stories of transformation and service. Each family had found ways to channel their grief into positive action, creating lasting tributes to their loved ones that were benefiting thousands of people. What struck Catherine most profoundly was that these initiatives were continuing to grow and evolve, taking on lives of their own that extended far beyond the original inspiration. The final section of the scrapbook contained a collective letter from all 17 families, addressed to both William and Catherine. The letter explained how they had found each other through their shared experience of receiving personal correspondence from the royal couple. Sarah Thompson had started a support group for families affected by the tragedy, and during their meetings, several people had mentioned receiving unexpected letters that had deeply moved them. As they compared their letters and realized they had all come from the same source, the families had been amazed by the time, care, and personal attention that had gone into each message. Rather than generic condolences, each family had received a letter that demonstrated genuine understanding of their specific loved one's life and contributions. The families had been so moved by this gesture that they had decided to stay connected and support each other's efforts to honor their relatives' legacies. The collective letter expressed gratitude that went far beyond simple appreciation for kind words during a difficult time. The families credited the royal letters with helping them transform their grief into purpose, their loss into legacy, and their pain into programs that were helping thousands of other people. They wrote about how the recognition and validation in the letters had given them permission to see their loved ones as the remarkable people they had always been, even if the wider world had never fully appreciated their contributions. Most remarkably, the letter described how their shared experience had created a new model for community response to tragedy. Instead of allowing grief to isolate them, the families had formed a network of mutual support that was generating positive change throughout their region and beyond. They had discovered that service to others was not just a way to honor their deceased loved ones, but also a powerful method of healing their own grief. Catherine found herself deeply moved as she read through the scrapbook. What had begun as a private gesture of compassion had evolved into something far more significant than she and William had ever imagined. Their 17 letters had not just provided comfort to grieving families. They had sparked a movement of community service and mutual support that was touching thousands of lives. The scrapbook also included media clippings about the various initiatives that had emerged from the family's efforts. Local newspapers had covered many of the programs, and some had achieved national attention. The coverage consistently emphasized the grassroots, community-driven nature of these projects, with families choosing to honor their loved ones through service rather than simply through memorial services or monuments. What particularly impressed Catherine was that none of the media coverage had mentioned the royal letters that had inspired these initiatives. The families had maintained the privacy and confidentiality that William and Catherine had requested, even when sharing their stories with journalists and community leaders. This discretion demonstrated the genuine nature of the gratitude and respect that the families felt toward their unexpected correspondence. The final page of the scrapbook contained a simple request. The families asked if William and Catherine would consider attending a collective memorial service they were planning for the first anniversary of the tragedy. The service would celebrate the lives of all 17 victims and would also recognize the positive changes that had emerged from the community's response to the loss. Catherine immediately shared the scrapbook with William, who was equally moved by the documentation of their letter's impact. They spent an evening reading through every page, marveling at the creativity and dedication that the families had shown in developing programs that reflected their loved ones' values and interests. The request to attend the memorial service presented a delicate decision. Their attendance would inevitably bring media attention to an event that had been planned as a private, community-centered gathering. However, Their absence might be seen as a lack of care or interest in the very community they had tried to support through their letters. After considerable discussion with their staff and with careful consultation with the organizing families, William and Catherine decided to attend the memorial service, but with specific conditions designed to maintain the focus on the families and their loved ones rather than on royal involvement. They would attend as private individuals rather than in official royal capacity. They would participate in the service without giving speeches or taking prominent roles, and they would request that media coverage focus on the community initiatives rather than on royal attendance. The memorial service, held on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 year after the tragedy, brought together hundreds of community members in the Manchester Park where many of the families had chosen to scatter their loved ones' ashes. The service was designed as a celebration of life rather than a mourning of death, with each family sharing stories about their relatives' contributions to the community and describing the ongoing project that were continuing their legacies. William and Catherine arrived quietly and took seats in the back of the gathered crowd, hoping to observe and participate without drawing attention away from the families and their tributes. However, their presence was noticed and appreciated by the community members, many of whom had heard rumors about royal letters but had never had confirmation of their existence. During the service, Sarah Thompson served as the primary speaker, describing how the tragedy had brought the families together and how their shared grief had been transformed into a network of mutual support and community service. She spoke about the power of recognition and validation during times of loss, about how acknowledging the significance of ordinary lives could inspire extraordinary responses to tragedy. While Sarah never explicitly mentioned the royal letters, those who knew about them understood the deeper meaning of her words. She talked about how sometimes the most meaningful comfort comes from unexpected sources, how genuine recognition of a person's contributions can help families see their loved ones' lives in new ways, and how private gestures of compassion can have public impacts that extend far beyond their original scope. The service concluded with the unveiling of a community garden dedicated to the memory of all 17 victims. Each section of the garden reflected the interests and values of one of the deceased, creating a living memorial that would continue to grow and change over time. Plaques throughout the garden described the various community initiatives that had emerged from the family's efforts to honor their relatives' legacies. As William and Catherine walked through the garden after the service, they were approached by family members who wanted to express their gratitude in person. These conversations were deeply moving, with several people sharing specific details about how the royal letters had helped them through their darkest moments and inspired them to transform their grief into positive action. Linda Chan told Catherine that her father would have been amazed to know that his engineering skills and immigrant success story had inspired a scholarship program that was helping other young people achieve their dreams. Elizabeth Davidson shared with William that learning to see her years of faithful visits as acts of love rather than obligation had freed her to use her experience to help other families facing similar challenges. The most poignant conversation came with Sarah Thompson, who had initiated the entire chain of community connection by reaching out to thank Catherine for her letter about grandmother Margaret. Sarah explained that the teacher Margaret would have been thrilled to know that her story had become part of a larger lesson about the importance of recognizing and celebrating the contributions of ordinary people who choose to serve others. As they returned to London that evening, William and Catherine reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with their decision to write personal letters to grieving families. What had started as a quiet act of compassion had evolved into a model for community healing and service that was inspiring similar initiatives in other cities facing their own tragedies. The experience had taught them profound lessons about the power of personal connection, the importance of recognizing ordinary acts of service, and the potential for private gestures to inspire public good. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful leadership happens not on public stages, but in the sacred space between one grieving heart and another caring soul. Their 17 letters had touched millions of lives, not through media coverage or public recognition, but through the ripple effects of families who had been moved to transform their loss into legacy, their grief into service, and their private pain into public good. It was a quiet act that had changed everything, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of human compassion can have the most profound and lasting impacts. The story of William and Catherine's letters would eventually become known throughout the world, inspiring countless other acts of private compassion and community service. But for the 17 families in Manchester, it would always be remembered as the moment when their darkest hour was touched by unexpected light, when their profound loss was transformed into purposeful hope, and when they learned that their loved ones' ordinary lives had been extraordinary enough to inspire a quiet revolution of kindness that would never truly end.